The badge reader was already screaming red when Marin Whitlock watched her interim CEO destroy a man's career 10 feet from where she stood dressed as a cleaner. Glass walls made every accusation visible to directors who had the power to stop it but wouldn't. Corbin Vale's voice carried down the marble corridor with practiced confidence. Darnell Sloan sabotaged filtration data in 6 counties. But what Marin saw next destroyed everything she thought she knew about choosing her company's next leader. The sabotage wasn't real. The login records were cloned, the timestamps impossible, the frame built by the same building systems supervisor who controlled which evidence the board could see. The undercover mission she'd planned to test executive character? A legal trap her own father had designed. The moment she put on that cleaner's uniform, she triggered an irrevocable clause that stripped her voting power and handed control to a Manhattan trustee. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before someone with access to your credentials decides you're the convenient scapegoat. Because Marin Whitlock is about to discover how many corporations choose stability over truth when the person asking questions can't prove who they are. Darnell Sloan sabotaged water systems in 6 American counties, and the proof was locked inside a cleaning cart no executive knew existed. Marin Whitlock stood 10 feet away in a borrowed cleaner's uniform, gray polo damp against her shoulders, rubber gloves still wet from scrubbing executive bathroom sinks, and watched the interim CEO destroy a man's career in front of witnesses who had the power to stop it but wouldn't. The badge reader screamed red for the 3rd time, the error beep echoing down the marble corridor outside the board's suite on the 42nd floor of Whitlock Meridian's Chicago headquarters. And Corbin Vale didn't bother lowering his voice, because humiliation only works when other people can see it land. This is the 3rd time the filtration data has been altered, Corbin said, eyes locked on Darnell like a prosecutor who'd already written the verdict, and it always traces back to one login. The glass walls of the executive corridor turned every word into theater, directors visible inside the board's suite, with faces flat and practiced, the kind of neutrality people wear when they vote on lives and call it governance. Darnell's palms were still wet from the lab sink. His Whitlock Meridian lanyard twisted sideways like someone had grabbed it mid-walk, and his mouth opened the way mouths open when a simple sentence feels like it should be enough to stop a machine already rolling. Behind Corbin, 2 board directors stood near the conference room door, arms crossed in that universal posture of people who've already decided not to get involved, and the ammonia smell from Marin's mop bucket mixed with the espresso scent drifting from the executive break room down the hall, creating the specific smell of a building that runs on performance whether anyone inside it tells the truth or not. Marin's hands tightened on the card handle, the damp rubber gloves making her grip feel uncertain, and she forced herself to stay still because the entire purpose of being dressed like this was to be invisible, to watch how power sounds when it thinks no one important is listening. Corbin didn't ask Darnell what happened or how the alteration was done or whether there might be another explanation for the login discrepancy, because questions like that suggest you're still deciding, and Corbin had the tone of a man who'd finished deciding hours ago. He just announced the conclusion, then turned slightly so the directors could hear the line that mattered most. We can't appoint a CEO while sabotage is ongoing. The word sabotage hung in the air like a diagnosis, and the directors nodded with the kind of synchronized agreement that makes you realize the script was written before anyone walked into the room. Marin had come to the 42nd floor at 11:17 p.m. not to mop marble, but to decide who deserved to run her company. And 3 nights of watching Corbin Vale work these halls like a man auditioning for permanence had taught her more about leadership than any earnings call ever could. She'd seen him laugh too loud with directors over drinks in the executive lounge, speak in careful legal tones near the compliance suite, pause at security desks the way a new sheriff pauses to make sure deputies understand the chain of command. She'd also watched the people below him, the ones who kept the company's products honest instead of keeping the stock price calm. And Darnell Sloan was one of them, a water quality analyst from the Pittsburgh facility in Allegheny County who'd flown into Chicago for what the calendar called cross-site alignment, but what everyone understood was a last-minute summons. He carried his laptop like it weighed more than electronics should, the kind of weight that comes from knowing what's inside it matters more than the meeting it's brought to, and he looked like a man who'd slept in airports and still showed up to the lab on time because someone had to. The first time Marin noticed him, It was because he'd stopped the service elevator to help her steady a cart while caught in the threshold, then apologized as if the building had personal feelings. "They never fixed that lip," he'd said, pressing the hold button so she could pull the cart in without scraping metal, and the gesture was small and human and exactly the kind of thing corporate weather destroys first when pressure arrives. She'd thanked him the way a night cleaner thanks someone, voice quiet and deferential, and he'd nodded without making eye contact because people in his position learn not to see the people in hers. Later that same night, she'd overheard him in a side hallway on a call he didn't know anyone could hear, voice low and controlled in the way people sound when they're trying not to panic out loud. "I'm telling you it's not a rounding error," he'd said into the phone, shoulders tight against the drywall. "The membranes passing on paper and failing in the field. King County samples don't match the internal baseline." Then he'd stopped, listening to whoever was on the other end, and added a sentence that made Marin's spine lock. "If they make me sign this, it becomes my lie." Now Corbin was building that lie in real time, and the board was letting him do it because the alternative was admitting the data might be telling the truth. A security supervisor stepped forward, hand already moving toward Darnell's arm, and Marin watched the way Darnell's shoulders pulled back, not aggression, just the reflex of someone who understands he's about to be touched in a way that redefines what kind of person he is. One of the directors, a man with a municipal seal lapel pin from some past career in Cook County government, shifted his weight like he wanted to say something, then didn't, and that silence was louder than anything Corbin had said because it proved the room had already chosen comfort over consequence. Marin's phone buzzed once in her pocket, a notification she ignored, and she felt the hard edges of the notebook she kept hidden in the cart's lower tray press against her hip through the canvas. All those county names and test dates and timeline discrepancies written in her own handwriting, evidence no one was supposed to have, because no one was supposed to be watching this closely. Corbin's eyes swept the hallway, landing on Marin for half a second, the kind of look that registers a cleaner the way you register furniture, and then moved past her back to Darnell. "Security will escort you out," Corbin said, voice smooth now, almost gentle, the tone people use when they want the cruelty to look like policy. "Your laptop and badge stay here. We'll be in touch through counsel." The phrase "through counsel" landed like a door closing, and Darnell's jaw tightened in a way that suggested he understood exactly what that meant. No more direct conversation, no more chance to explain, just lawyers and separation agreements, and the long, slow work of making sure the story that survives is the one the building needs. Marin's hand moved toward the cleaning supplies in her cart, fingers brushing the edge of the sealed envelope she'd prepared 3 days ago, the one with chain of custody documentation from sample sites Corbin didn't know anyone had preserved, and she made herself stop because the timing wasn't right yet, because stepping forward now would only prove she'd been lying about who she was. And lying was the one thing the board could use to strip her voting power entirely. If you've ever watched someone get blamed for telling the truth at work and told yourself it wasn't your problem, remember this moment, because the difference between a witness and an accomplice is whether you decide the machinery is more important than the person it's about to crush. The board suite door opened wider, an assistant stepping out to murmur something to Corbin, and Marin saw the vote agenda clipped to the assistant's tablet. CEO succession listed third beneath covenant compliance review and lender status update. Corbin angled his body so the directors inside could see him handling the disruption, playing the role of the steady hand in chaos. And when he glanced back toward Darnell one final time, Marin saw something in his expression that wasn't anger or even concern. It was satisfaction, the look of someone who'd just cleared the last obstacle between himself and something he'd been planning to take for a long time. The security supervisor's radio crackled, a voice on the other end confirming the executive floor was clear for the vote to proceed, and Marin understood with perfect clarity that she was watching a rehearsal become a ceremony, that every person in this hallway had been positioned exactly where Corbin needed them to be. She looked at Darnell, at the way his hands stayed open at his sides instead of clenched, at the dignity he was choosing even as the room tried to take it from him, and she knew that whatever happened next, she couldn't let the story Corbin was building be the only story that survived the night. Marin Whitlock hadn't come to the 42nd floor to mop marble, and the cheap name tag clipped crooked on her polo, borrowed from a staffing agency that didn't ask questions when you paid enough. wasn't meant to fool security forever, just long enough to hear what her own executives said when they thought the owner was recovering at a discreet medical facility in Lake County, Illinois. The public believed she was taking time away for health, the kind of vague announcement that sounds responsible until you realize it means the board stopped asking her opinion 2 weeks ago and started making decisions under something they called an emergency covenant review. The lenders believed she'd sign whatever kept the quarterly numbers calm. The board believed she was out of the way, and none of them believed she would ride the service elevator at 11:17 p.m. in a uniform that smelled like industrial cleaner just to find out which of them deserved to run the company her father built in Cook County back when water filtration meant keeping promises to municipalities instead of managing stock price expectations. She'd started 3 nights ago, taking the contractor route through facilities management, the kind of night shift cleaning work that puts you in executive corridors after the important people leave, but before the building locks down completely. The service elevator access gave her floors most employees never saw, and the timing gave her something more valuable than access. It gave her the truth about how people behave when they think no one who matters is watching. Corbin Vale had spent those 3 nights working the halls like a man who'd already decided the CEO's seat was his, laughing too loud with directors over scotch in the executive lounge, speaking in measured legal tones near the compliance suite, stopping at security posts to ask casual questions that weren't casual at all, the kind of questions that establish who reports to whom when the org chart gets redrawn. She'd watched him position himself as the steady hand, the reliable choice, the leader who could navigate covenant pressure without disrupting the narrative investors wanted to hear, and every conversation she overheard made her understand that stability and honesty weren't the same thing, and the board had already chosen which one mattered more. But she'd also watched Darnell Sloan, and watching him was what turned her undercover mission from a test of executive character into something that felt like bearing witness. The first time she saw him stop to help her with the stuck elevator threshold, the small human kindness of holding the door and apologizing for a building flaw he didn't cause, she'd marked him as someone who hadn't been broken yet by the machinery of corporate survival. Then later, standing in a side hallway near the legal suite at 1:43 a.m. while he made that phone call he thought was private, she'd heard the exact moment a good person realizes they're about to be forced into a choice between their integrity and their livelihood. "If they make me sign this, it becomes my lie," he'd said into the phone, forehead pressed against drywall like the wall was the only thing holding him upright. And after he ended the call, he'd added something quieter, almost to himself. "I'll be home before your science fair, I promise." The sentence landed in Marin's chest like a weight because it meant he had a daughter. It meant the pressure wasn't just professional, and it meant the people who wanted him silent understood exactly where to apply force. By the 4th night, the building's urgency had developed edges sharp enough to cut. Marin found a lender notice abandoned in a copier tray near the legal suite, the kind of document that should never leave a locked drawer, but sometimes does when people print in a hurry and forget to collect the evidence of their panic. The letterhead was from a Manhattan institution she recognized. The language was polite in the way legal threats are polite when the consequences are already drafted, and the timeline was clear. 72 hours to cure a performance breach or face remedial control measures. A phrase that sounded bureaucratic until you understood it meant someone other than the board would start making decisions about who ran the company. Clipped to the back of the notice was a presentation slide someone had marked up in red pen, cities circled like targets: Tacoma and Pierce County, Washington; Flint and Genesee County, Michigan; Corpus Christi in Nueces County, Texas; a cluster around Cleveland and Cuyahoga County, Ohio; then a thick aggressive underline through Austin and Travis County, where Whitlock Meridian had promised a municipal water upgrade contract so large it would make the financial press write headlines about expansion and reliability. She didn't need anyone to explain what the board wouldn't say in official minutes. If filtration performance data was being questioned, the Austin contract would die in committee, the lender would invoke the covenant, the stock would stumble in morning trading, and the CEO's seat would stop being a promotion and start being a lifeboat with only enough room for someone willing to throw the right people overboard. Marin photographed the document with a phone she'd bought specifically for this work, a device with no connection to her name or her accounts. Then put the papers back exactly as she'd found them because the moment people knew she was watching, The performance would change, and she'd lose access to the truth. She moved through the legal suite like she belonged there, emptying trash bins that didn't need emptying, wiping down conference tables that were already cleaned, and noticed for the first time that security patrols had doubled near this wing, guards walking routes that felt less like protection and more like perimeter control. In the executive break room at 2:40 a.m., while the espresso machine hissed and filled the small space with the smell of burned coffee, someone had left heating too long. Marin overheard two directors discuss the CEO vote with the casual tone people use when they're deciding something that will destroy lives but won't touch their own. "We need a clean narrative before the committee meets," one said, a woman whose voice Marin recognized from earnings calls, steady and practiced. "The lab analyst is already on record raising alarms about field mismatches," the other replied, a man who served on the audit committee and should have cared more about what field mismatches meant for actual water quality. Then Corbin arrived like he'd been summoned by stage cue, pouring himself coffee with the easy confidence of someone who'd already won, and added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "You'll have a scapegoat by morning, and then you can vote without the noise." The word scapegoat sat in the break room like something physical, and Marin felt her hands tighten on the spray bottle she was holding, the plastic flexing under her grip. She wanted to walk into that room under her real name, stop the conversation, call her attorney, drag the truth into daylight the way money and ownership are supposed to enable. But something stopped her. Not fear exactly, more like the suspicion that the simple move was the wrong move. That power this comfortable with sacrificing someone had already planned for the moment when she stepped forward to object. She finished wiping the counter that didn't need wiping, emptied the trash that was barely full, and left the break room while the directors kept talking, their voices fading behind her as she pushed the cleaning cart back toward the service elevator. That's when she found the folder, tucked behind a cabinet in the legal suite that wasn't locked because it didn't need to be, because the people who had access to this room were supposed to be the only people who mattered. The label was plain, typed in the kind of font lawyers use when they want documents to look inevitable. Irrevocable voting trust. Whitlock Meridian. Marin's hands went still on the folder edge, and she felt something cold move through her chest, because irrevocable isn't a word people use when they're protecting your interests. It's a word they use when they're protecting themselves from you. She opened the folder carefully, positioned her body so anyone walking past would see a cleaner organizing supplies, and read clauses written in language so calm it took her 3 passes to understand what her father had actually signed years before he died. The terms were specific. If the owner directly interfered in CEO succession during a covenant emergency, if she revealed herself as an undercover participant, if she influenced directors or disrupted the independent process in any way that could be classified as interference, her voting power would transfer immediately to a trustee until the company was stabilized. Stabilized wasn't defined, which meant it could mean anything. The trustee wasn't family or council she'd chosen. It was a financial institution headquartered in Manhattan, the same institution whose letterhead she'd seen on the lender notice, and the representative's name sat at the bottom of the page like a trap that had been waiting years to spring. Marin read the trigger condition twice more, her mouth going dry, because the clause didn't just restrict what she could do. It made the act of caring, the act of stepping forward to protect her own company, into the mechanism that would strip her control. This wasn't protection. It was a cage built by someone who'd loved her but hadn't trusted her judgment when crisis came. And the realization that her father had designed this years ago felt like betrayal, wearing a signature she recognized. She closed the folder, put it back exactly where it had been, and stood in the legal suite while the building hummed around her with the white noise of HVAC systems and distant security radios. Every decision she'd witnessed in the past 3 nights rewired itself in her mind. The accelerated vote wasn't just a response to lender pressure, it was a lever designed to move ownership. Corbin's confidence wasn't just ambition, it was timing. The board's nervousness wasn't conscience, it was the fear of being caught between a covenant and a billionaire who might still have enough power to make their lives difficult. And Darnell wasn't being blamed because he was convenient. He was being blamed because he was a hinge, because if his field failure data was believed, the company would have to halt shipments, issue recalls, admit publicly that filtration systems were passing lab tests, but failing in actual counties where actual people drank the water his work was supposed to keep safe. Subscribe before you convince yourself that looking away is the same thing as staying neutral, because the systems that destroy decent people count on everyone choosing comfort over witness. Marin left the legal suite and took the service elevator down to the 38th floor, where the facility's office kept equipment she could pretend to restock, and tried to steady her breathing against the reality that she'd come here to choose the next CEO, and discovered instead that the choice had been designed to cost her everything. Marin started collecting evidence the way investigators collect evidence when they can't admit they're investigating, which meant abandoned printouts from copier trays, meeting agenda headers left on conference tables, sticky notes crumpled in executive trash bins that revealed more in what they abbreviated than in what they said completely. The facilities cart gave her access and invisibility in equal measure, and over the next 18 hours she moved through Whitlock Meridian's executive floors like weather, present but unremarkable, watching the machinery of a cover-up assemble itself in real time. The first fragment came from a printer jam on the 40th floor, where someone had tried to force-feed a color presentation through a black and white machine and abandoned the wrinkled output when it came through streaked and unreadable. Marin smoothed the page against the cart surface and saw a map of the continental United States with red circles marked over specific cities. Tacoma and Seattle clustered in Pierce and King counties, Washington, Flint bright and unmissable in Genesee County, Michigan, Cleveland and its suburbs spreading across Cuyahoga County, Ohio, then Corpus Christi down in Nueces County, Texas, and finally Austin and Travis County with a star drawn so heavily the pen had torn through the paper. Each circle had a date written in margin shorthand, and the dates ran sequential across a 6-month span that ended 2 weeks ago, which meant whatever was happening in those counties had already happened, and the question wasn't whether there was a problem, but whether anyone would be allowed to say it out loud. Marin photographed the page, returned it to the recycling bin where she'd found it, and kept moving because standing still in executive corridors attracts attention in ways that moving with purpose does not. The second fragment came from the legal suite's shared printer, a document someone had printed at 3:47 a.m. and never collected, probably because they'd realized mid-print that having a physical copy was more dangerous than keeping the file digital and deniable. The header read Field Performance Anomaly Log, and beneath it ran a table with columns for site location, sample date, membrane lot number, and a final column labeled Variance from Baseline that was filled with percentages high enough to make Marin's stomach tighten. Tacoma's intake facility showed a 34% variance. King County's municipal connection showed 29%, Flint's rehabilitation site showed 41%, and the numbers kept climbing as her eyes moved down the page until she reached a bolded footer note that said in careful legal language, "Preliminary data suggests membrane degradation inconsistent with accelerated lab testing. Recommend halt on Travis County installation pending secondary review." Someone had drawn a single red line through the word halt and written in margin scrawl, "Per CV, align messaging first." CV meant Corbinvale, which meant the decision to keep installing systems that were failing in the field was being made by the same person positioning himself as the stable choice for CEO, and the word align didn't mean fix the problem. It meant control the narrative so the problem looked like something else. Marin felt her jaw tighten as she photographed the page, and when she heard footsteps approaching down the corridor, she folded the paper back exactly as she'd found it, stepped away from the printer, and began emptying a trash bin that was already empty, because looking busy is the best camouflage in buildings where everyone else is trying to look important. The footsteps belonged to a man she'd seen twice before, but never close enough to identify. Someone who moved through executive floors with a keyring that had too many access cards and a confidence that suggested he wasn't visiting, he belonged. He wore a facilities polo similar to hers, but his had a supervisor patch and his boots had the worn-in look of someone who'd been opening locked doors in this building long before the current crisis started. He glanced at her once, the kind of look that catalogs without caring, then used one of his key cards to unlock a storage closet Marin hadn't realized was restricted. She watched from the corner of her eye as he retrieved something small enough to fit in his pocket, locked the closet again, and walked back toward the elevator bank without acknowledging her presence a second time. Later, when she checked the access log printout she'd pulled from a recycling bin near security, she found his name attached to a badge clone request filed 3 days ago. Jory Kellen, Building Systems Supervisor, authorized for master access and credential duplication. The words credential duplication sat on the page like a confession waiting to be noticed, because there was no legitimate reason to clone employee badges unless you wanted someone's access without their knowledge, and Marin realized with cold certainty that Darnell's login wasn't being used by Darnell. It was being used by someone who'd copied his credentials and could now make any data change look like it came from the one person who'd been raising alarms about field failures. She photographed the log, her hands steadier than her breathing, and understood that what she was watching wasn't just a frame. It was an architecture, a system built to protect certain conclusions by making sure the person who questioned those conclusions became the person who looked guilty. The third fragment came during a quiet hour on the 41st floor, when Marin used her facility's override to unlock a conference room that should have been empty, but had a projector still warm and a whiteboard covered in handwriting someone had tried to erase, but hadn't wiped completely. The ghost text was faint but readable in the right light. Narrative priorities. Then beneath it a bulleted list that read like instructions for a controlled demolition. 1. Contained a single point of failure. 2. Establish timeline that protects contracts. 3. Position analyst error as root cause. 4. Harmonize internal data before external review. The word harmonize was underlined twice, and Marin stared at it long enough to feel her vision blur, because harmonize was the kind of verb people used when they meant destroy evidence, but wanted it to sound like process improvement. She took 3 photographs from different angles to make sure the faint text would be visible, then wiped the board completely so no one would know someone had documented their plan to bury the truth under language that sounded like quality control. By the time she returned to the service elevator, her cart held cleaning supplies on top and a carefully organized collection of evidence underneath. Documents folded into equipment manuals, photographs stored on a phone wrapped in a microfiber cloth, and a small notebook where she'd written county names and dates in her own handwriting, because sometimes the most important evidence is the pattern you notice when you put fragments side by side and see the shape they make together. She was halfway to the 38th floor when the elevator lurched to a stop between levels, the overhead light flickering once before the emergency intercom crackled to life. Facilities override. A voice said, calm and procedural. Please hold for systems check. Marin's hand moved instinctively to the cart's lower tray, fingers brushing the edge of the notebook, and she forced herself to breathe slowly while the elevator stayed frozen and the intercom stayed silent. 30 seconds passed, then a minute, and she could hear her own heartbeat in the enclosed space, could smell the cleaning solution and the faint mechanical scent of elevator grease, could feel the weight of every photograph and document she'd collected pressing against her awareness like evidence that would either save someone or condemn her. Then the intercom crackled again, same voice, same procedural tone. Clear. Resuming. The elevator dropped smoothly back into motion, and Marin exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, but the message was received. Someone knew the elevators were being used outside normal routes. Someone had the ability to stop them remotely, and someone wanted her to understand that being invisible only worked until the building decided to look. She reached the 38th floor, stepped out with her cart, and checked her phone to find a single text from an unknown number, time-stamped 2 minutes ago. Curiosity is admirable. Interference is expensive. She read it twice, deleted it, then walked to the facilities office and locked herself in a supply closet that had no cameras and no windows. Her hands were shaking now, not from fear exactly, but from the understanding that she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't uncross, that the evidence she'd collected made her dangerous to people who had the resources to make danger disappear quietly. She thought about Darnell, about the way he'd looked in that hallway with his badge screaming red and his career being dismantled in front of directors who had the power to stop it but chose comfort instead, and she thought about the counties marked in red on that crumpled printout. Real places with real people who drank water that was failing tests the company was choosing to harmonize instead of fix. Marin pulled out her phone, opened the photo gallery, and looked at the image of the whiteboard text, at the phrase, position analyst error as root cause, and understood that by morning Darnell would be more than blamed. He would be the story, the single point of failure, the explanation that let everyone else sleep at night, while filtration systems kept failing in Tacoma and Flint and Cleveland and all the other places where people trusted that the science was honest because they had no way to check it themselves. She put the phone away, stood in the dark supply closet, and made a decision that felt less like strategy and more like witnessing. She would document everything, preserve every fragment, and if the building wanted to call that interference, she would make sure the interference was worth the cost. The last fragment came at 4:18 a.m., when she found a compliance officer printing a termination packet in a side office near HR, the pages still warm from the printer and organized in a folder that already had a name typed on the tab. Sloan, Darnell, separation. The signature lines were blank. The effective date was listed as immediate upon execution, and the reason for termination was pre-written in language so neutral it could mean anything. Performance concerns and policy compliance issues requiring immediate resolution. Marin photographed the packet through the office doorway, her angle careful to avoid reflection in the glass, and watched the compliance officer add the folder to a stack of documents labeled for morning executive review. She thought about the phrase Corbin had used in the break room, "You'll have a scapegoat by morning," and realized he hadn't been speculating. He'd been confirming a timeline, and the machinery that would destroy Darnell Sloan's career had been assembled in advance, every document prepared, every signature line ready, every narrative priority checked and aligned. Marin returned to her cart, pushed it toward the service elevator, and felt the weight of what she knew settle against her ribs like armor she couldn't take off. Somewhere above her the board was preparing to vote. Somewhere in the building Corbin was positioning himself as the answer to chaos he'd helped create. And somewhere in a hotel near O'Hare, or maybe already on a flight back to Pittsburgh, Darnell Sloan was trying to sleep before a morning that would redefine everything he'd built, unaware that the people who needed him silent had already decided his guilt and were just waiting for dawn to make it official. The badge escort happened at 9:47 a.m. in the main laboratory corridor on the 35th floor, where the morning light came through floor-to-ceiling windows and made everything look clean and professional and exactly like the kind of place where science mattered more than politics. Darnell Sloan was standing near a fume hood with a tablet in his hands, reviewing overnight test results with the careful attention of someone who still believed his work would be evaluated on accuracy instead of convenience, when two corporate security officers appeared at his shoulder and asked him to step into the hallway. Marin watched from a supply closet across the corridor, door cracked just enough to see without being seen, and she felt her chest tighten as Darnell's expression shifted from confusion to understanding in the space of a single breath. "What's this about?" he asked, voice steady but quieter than it had been a moment before, and the senior security officer replied with the practiced neutrality of someone reading from a script. "Your badge access has been restricted pending an internal review. We need to collect your laptop and employee credentials." The word pending made it sound temporary, made it sound like procedure, but Marin had seen the separation packet with Darnell's name already typed on the folder tab, had seen the signature lines waiting to be filled, and she knew that pending was just the word they used to make compliance feel voluntary before they made it mandatory. Darnell set his tablet down on the nearest bench with the careful precision of someone trying not to let his hands shake, then removed his laptop from his bag and his badge from his lanyard and placed both on the counter between himself and security like he was surrendering weapons instead of tools. "I'd like to speak with my supervisor," he said, and the request was so reasonable it made the refusal more cruel when it came. "Your supervisor has been notified," the officer replied. "Legal will reach out through appropriate channels." The phrase appropriate channels meant lawyers, meant separation agreements, meant Darnell wouldn't get to tell his side of the story to anyone who had the authority to believe him, and Marin watched his shoulders pull back in a reflex that looked like dignity, choosing to stay visible even when everything else was being stripped away. Then the compliance officer arrived, a woman in a gray suit who carried a folder Marin recognized, because she'd photographed it 4 hours earlier when it was still sitting on a printer tray waiting for morning. The woman's voice was soft, almost kind, the tone people use when they want cruelty to sound like concern. "Mr. Sloan, we've prepared a separation agreement that addresses the concerns raised about unauthorized data access," she said, opening the folder so he could see the pages already formatted and printed, his name filled in, his termination date listed as immediate. "If you sign today, We can process your final compensation without delay and provide a neutral reference for future employment. The offer sounded generous until you understood what it actually meant. Sign this and admit guilt quietly, or refuse, and we'll make sure every future employer knows you left under investigation for sabotage. Darnell looked at the agreement, then at the compliance officer, then at the security personnel standing close enough to touch him if he made the wrong choice. And Marin saw the exact moment he understood he was being given the appearance of options while the actual decision had already been made for him. I didn't access anything unauthorized, he said, voice still steady but carrying an edge now. The sound of someone who'd spent the last 12 hours realizing that truth wasn't a defense against a predetermined conclusion. The login flagged as suspicious as mine, but I didn't use it to alter data. Someone cloned my credentials. The compliance officer's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of answer. That's a serious allegation, she said, in a tone that made serious sound like hysterical. If you have evidence, you're welcome to present it through the formal review process. But there was no formal review process, or if there was, it existed on paper the same way the separation agreement existed on paper, as theater meant to make institutional decisions look like individual choices. Darnell didn't sign, and Marin felt something sharp and painful move through her chest, because refusing meant he was choosing the harder path, the one where he'd have to explain to his daughter why he was home during school hours and couldn't promise when he'd work again. The compliance officer's voice dropped lower, intimate now, like she was sharing a confidence instead of delivering a threat. Mr. Sloan, you have a daughter in 4th grade at Madison Elementary in DuPage County, she said, and the sentence hung in the air like a piece of information that had no business being in this conversation unless it was meant to be used. You don't want this situation to become more complicated than it needs to be. Think about what's best for your family. The mention of his daughter wasn't accidental, wasn't sympathy. It was pressure applied to the exact place where pressure would hurt most, and Marin watched Darnell's face go still in the way faces go still when someone has just threatened something more important than a career. He didn't respond immediately, just stood there with his hands at his sides and his badge and laptop already confiscated, and Marin could see him doing the calculation every parent does when the choice is between protecting yourself and protecting your child. I need time to review this with an attorney, he finally said. And even though the words were measured, Marin could hear the fear underneath them, could hear a father realizing that fighting back might mean putting his daughter's safety into an equation where corporations had more resources than one family could withstand. The compliance officer closed the folder, her expression pleasant and empty. You have until end of business today, she said. After that, the offer changes. She didn't specify how it would change, didn't need to, because the threat was in the unsaid. Sign now while we're being generous, or refuse and discover what happens when we stop pretending this is a negotiation. Security escorted Darnell toward the elevator bank, not touching him but close enough that leaving wasn't optional, and Marin stayed in the supply closet until they'd turned the corner and the corridor was empty again except for the tablet Darnell had left on the lab bench, still displaying the overnight test results he'd been reviewing before his professional life ended in the space of a 10-minute conversation. Marin wanted to do something immediate and visible, wanted to walk into that hallway under her real name and stop the machinery before it crushed someone who'd only tried to keep the work honest. But the voting trust clause she'd found the night before sat in her memory like a lock she couldn't pick, reminding her that stepping forward as the owner could trigger the exact mechanism that would strip her voting power and hand control to a Manhattan trustee who had no reason to care about Darnell, or water quality, or anything except stability measured in quarterly reports. She pulled out her phone instead and sent an anonymous message to the compliance officer's work email, a simple question sourced to look like it came from routine IT audit. Please confirm authorization for badge credential duplication requests filed March 18th under Building Systems Authority. It wasn't much, wasn't enough, but it was a breadcrumb that might make someone pause long enough to ask questions Corbin Vale didn't want answered. Then she left the building through the loading dock exit on the ground floor, riding the service elevator down with her cleaning cart and her borrowed name tag, and all the evidence she'd collected over 4 nights of watching her own company prepare to sacrifice an honest employee to protect a profitable lie. She took the Blue Line train north toward Evanston, changed trains twice to make sure no one was following her, and didn't relax until she was 3 blocks from her apartment building. Walking on a residential street where the morning felt ordinary and disconnected from the crisis she'd just left behind. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had good security and better anonymity, the kind of place where neighbors didn't ask questions and landlords cashed checks without caring who signed them. And Marin had chosen it specifically because being invisible required living in spaces where no one looked too closely. She unlocked her door, stepped inside, and felt the wrongness immediately, not in what was present, but in what was absent. The cheap notebook she kept her handwritten notes in, the one she'd left on the kitchen counter because she'd been too tired to file it properly after the previous night's evidence collection, was gone. Not misplaced, not knocked to the floor, just missing in a way that made the air feel thinner. Marin's hands went cold as she moved through the apartment, checking windows and locks and finding everything secure. No forced entry, no broken glass, no signs of disturbance except for the single missing item and the torn page she found in the recycling bin. The page where she'd written county names and test dates and drawn connecting lines between Corbin's meetings and the Covenant timeline. She stood in her kitchen and understood with perfect clarity that someone had been inside her apartment, had known exactly what to take, and had wanted her to notice the absence because the message wasn't, "We're watching." It was, "We can reach you anywhere." On the kitchen table sat a plain envelope with no return address, the kind you buy in bulk at office supply stores, and inside was a photocopy of the voting trust clause she'd found the night before, the trigger line highlighted in yellow, and beneath it a single typed sentence: "Choose silence or lose control." Marin read it twice before the worst part registered. The photocopy was from the exact page she'd photographed in the legal suite, which meant someone knew she'd been in that room, knew what she'd found, and knew enough about her to understand that the trust clause was a trap she couldn't escape without triggering. She sat down at the kitchen table, hands shaking now not from fear but from rage, because being threatened was one thing, but being threatened in her own home with legal language her father had written was something else entirely. She thought about Darnell being escorted out of the lab, thought about his daughter's school being mentioned like a weapon, thought about the counties circled in red on that abandoned printout, and the people in those places who had no idea their water filtration systems were failing tests that corporations were choosing to harmonize instead of fix. She thought about the choice the anonymous message was offering: stay silent and keep ownership, or speak up and lose everything to a trustee who would stabilize the company by making sure no one ever raised uncomfortable questions again. Then she made a decision that felt less like strategy and more like refusing to let fear choose her path. She wasn't going to disappear into safety and let the board vote, and let Darnell take the fall, and let the water stay contaminated just because stepping forward might cost her control. But she also wasn't going to step forward the way they expected, wasn't going to reveal herself as the billionaire owner walking into a boardroom to fix things with authority that could be stripped the moment she used it. Instead, she was going to stay invisible and gather evidence they couldn't dismiss and find a way to protect the truth without triggering the clause, because the only way to beat a trap designed to punish interference was to make sure the interference couldn't be classified as yours. Marin pulled out her phone, booked a flight to Pittsburgh under a name that wasn't hers, and started planning how to get the sealed lab samples that would prove Darnell's field failure reports were accurate and Corbin's harmonized data was a lie. She had maybe 36 hours before the board vote, maybe less before Darnell signed the separation agreement out of fear for his daughter's safety, and the anonymous warning sitting on her kitchen table felt less like a threat now and more like confirmation that she was finally doing something the building's machinery couldn't ignore. Marin didn't sleep on the flight to Pittsburgh, and when the plane descended through cloud cover over Allegheny County at 6:23 a.m., she watched the Monongahela River cut through industrial landscape and thought about her father's signature on the voting trust document, about the way legal language could sound protective until you understood it was designed to protect the company from you instead of you from the company. The document she'd found in the legal suite had been clear about one thing: interference during a Covenant emergency would trigger immediate transfer of voting power to a Manhattan trustee until the company was stabilized. But what the clause hadn't specified, what she'd assumed she understood but was starting to realize she didn't, was what exactly counted as interference. Because if going undercover to observe executive behavior qualified, She'd already violated the terms just by putting on the cleaner's uniform and riding the service elevator into spaces owners weren't supposed to access without announcing themselves. She landed, rented a car under the fake ID she'd used to book the flight, and drove east through neighborhoods that looked like they'd been built when steel was king and hadn't figured out yet what to become now that the mills were gone. The Whitlock Meridian Lab facility sat in a low industrial park near the county line, the kind of building that doesn't announce itself because the work inside is supposed to speak for itself, and Marin parked 3 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance because rental cars have GPS, and she'd learned over the past 4 days that the machinery tracking her had resources she was still discovering. She entered through a side entrance marked for vendor deliveries, flashing a generic contractor badge that facilities management issues to people who fix HVAC systems and water lines. And the security guard waved her through without looking up from his phone because contractors are invisible the same way cleaners are invisible, present but unremarkable, necessary but beneath notice. The lab director's office was on the 2nd floor, past rows of spectroscopy equipment and refrigerated sample storage. And when Marin knocked on the door marked Dr. Felix Amarian, Quality Assurance, the man who opened it had the tired eyes of someone who'd been expecting a confrontation and was relieved it had finally arrived. "You're not from facilities," he said, statement not question, and Marin replied with the only truth that mattered. "I'm here about the King County samples." His expression shifted, not to suspicion but to something that looked like recognition, and he stepped back to let her inside an office that smelled like coffee and paper and the particular chemical scent of a lab that runs tests overnight and emails results people don't want to read. Dr. Amarian closed the door, moved to his desk, and pulled a hard drive from a locked drawer with the careful handling of someone who knows he's holding evidence that could end his career or save it, depending on who sees it first. "We were told not to transmit these," he said, voice low even though the office was empty and the nearest colleague was 2 floors down. An independent monitor flagged the chain of custody protocols 3 months ago and put a hold on external reporting until verification could be completed. The phrase independent monitor landed in Marin's awareness like a second earthquake because she'd seen those words in margin notes and overheard them in hallway conversations, but had assumed they meant some internal compliance function, some committee that reviewed policies and wrote recommendations no one read. "What monitor?" she asked, keeping her voice steady even as her chest tightened. "Who authorized external oversight?" Dr. Amarian looked at her like she'd asked a question that should have been answered years ago. "Your father did," he said. "When the company took the first municipal contract in Tacoma back in 2019, the city required third-party verification of all field performance data as a condition of the agreement. The contract included a provision for an independent monitor with access to raw testing results and the authority to flag discrepancies before they became public." He handed her a printed email dated 6 years prior. The sender listed as Oversight Compliance, Whitlock Meridian, and the text explaining in careful legal language that all field sampling would be logged with an external monitor who could review data integrity and chain of custody procedures without requiring board approval or executive notification. Marin read the email 3 times while her understanding of the past 4 days rewired itself completely. The monitor wasn't something imposed after wrongdoing. It was something her father had agreed to proactively, probably because he'd understood that public trust in water quality required verification that couldn't be controlled by the people selling the systems. But what he'd created, intentionally or not, was an infrastructure that could be weaponized, because if someone inside the company learned how to influence or delay what the monitor saw, they could control what counted as verified truth and what got buried as pending review. The monitor flagged chain of custody concerns 3 months ago, Dr. Amarian continued, pulling up an email thread on his desktop screen. "We were told to halt transmission of field samples until the protocols could be updated, which meant everything we collected from King County, Pierce County, Genesee County, all of it, went into sealed storage instead of into the reporting system." He turned the screen so Marin could see the email sender, Jory Kellen, Building Systems and Compliance Liaison. The same name she'd seen on the badge cloning authorization, the same facilities supervisor who moved through executive corridors with master access and the quiet authority of someone who knew which doors stayed locked and which cameras could be turned off without anyone noticing. Kellen told us the monitor needed time to review custody procedures, Dr. Amarian said, and his voice carried the particular frustration of someone who'd followed instructions that sounded reasonable until you realized they'd been designed to bury evidence. But the samples are still here, still sealed, still viable for testing. If someone wanted to verify Darnell's field failure reports, they could pull the hash logs and compare them to what compliance is calling altered data. Marin felt her breath catch because the second layer of the trap was suddenly visible. Her father had built oversight to protect truth, and someone had learned how to use that oversight to hide it, positioning themselves between the monitor and the data so they could decide what got flagged as suspicious and what got cleared as harmonized. "Who has access to the monitor's communications?" she asked. Dr. Amarian's answer was immediate and damning. "Building systems. Everything routes through Kellen's infrastructure because the monitor's portal is hosted on company servers." Which meant Jory Kellen could see what the monitor requested, could delay what the monitor received, and could position himself as the helpful intermediary who was just following protocols while actually controlling every piece of evidence that might contradict the narrative Corbinvale was building for the board. Marin took the hard drive, felt its weight settle against her palm like a weapon she didn't know how to use yet, and asked the question that would determine whether the next 36 hours saved anyone or just confirmed her father's legal architecture was more effective at trapping her than protecting the company. "If I take this back to Chicago and present it as evidence, does the monitor get notified automatically?" Dr. Amarian shook his head. "Not unless you route it through the official portal, which means Kellen sees it first." The trap closed tighter in her mind. She could preserve evidence, but presenting it through proper channels meant the people controlling those channels would know she had it before anyone who could act on it saw what it proved. She was halfway back to the rental car, hard drive wrapped in a clean lab coat and tucked under her arm like vendor equipment, when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, the third message in 4 days from someone who seemed to know exactly where she was and what she was doing. This one was shorter than the others. Just 8 words that rewired everything she thought she understood about the trust clause and why someone had left a highlighted copy on her kitchen table. "Going undercover was interference. You triggered it yesterday." Marin stopped walking, cold moving through her chest despite the morning sun, and read the message again because triggered meant past tense, meant done, meant the voting power she thought she still controlled had already transferred to the Manhattan trustee, and she'd been operating for the past 18 hours under the assumption she had authority. She'd actually lost the moment she put on a cleaner's uniform and stepped into her own building pretending to be someone else. She pulled out her phone and searched for the trust document she'd photographed in the legal suite, scrolling to the trigger clause and reading it with new attention to the language she'd skimmed before. Direct interference includes, but is not limited to, undisclosed observation of executive functions, covert participation in governance activities, or any action taken under false identity during a declared emergency period. The words undisclosed observation and false identity sat on the screen like accusations, and Marin realized with sick certainty that whoever had drafted this clause had anticipated exactly what she would do, had known that a concerned owner would eventually want to see how decisions were made when she wasn't in the room, and had built the trap specifically to punish that impulse by classifying it as interference the moment it occurred. She stood on a Pittsburgh street 3 blocks from a laboratory that held evidence of corporate negligence, holding a hard drive that could prove Darnell Sloan's innocence and Corbinvale's guilt, and understood that the choice she thought she was making, between revealing herself and staying hidden, had already been made for her by legal language her father had signed years before he died. The trustee had her voting power, which meant the board vote would proceed without her input, which meant Corbin would become CEO, or someone equally committed to stability over truth would take the seat. And the only question left was whether she could preserve enough evidence to matter even after control had been transferred to people whose job was protecting quarterly returns instead of water quality in counties most shareholders would never visit. Subscribe before you tell yourself that following the rules will protect you from the people who wrote them, because the systems that trap decent intentions are always designed by someone who knew exactly what you'd try to do and built the cage before you realized you were walking into it. Marin got in the rental car, set the hard drive on the passenger seat, and called the one person whose job was supposed to be protecting her interests even when legal architecture said otherwise, her attorney, a woman named Claudia Reese who'd handled the family's affairs since before Marin's father died, and who answered on the second ring with the clipped tone of someone reading bad news in real time. The trustee filed notice an hour ago, Claudia said without preamble. They're claiming you violated the emergency interference clause by conducting covert observation of board activities. I'm looking at the filing now. They have security footage, elevator logs, and a facilities contractor agreement with your signature on the fake ID documentation. The air went out of Marin's lungs because having evidence meant they'd been building the case, while she thought she was being invisible, meant every night she'd spent in that building watching executives perform their roles had been recorded and logged, and saved for exactly this moment when they could use her own investigation against her. Can we challenge it? She asked, knowing the answer before Claudia spoke it. Not during the emergency period, her attorney replied. The trust is irrevocable specifically to prevent ownership disputes from disrupting crisis governance. You can file for review after stabilization, but stabilization isn't defined by timeline. It's defined by trustee determination, which means they control when you get your voting power back. Marin ended the call, sat in the rental car with the hard drive evidence beside her and the reality of her situation settling like weight she couldn't lift, and understood that her father hadn't just failed to trust her judgment in crisis. He'd built a legal structure that assumed her caring would be the problem and institutional control would be the solution. And now she was living inside that assumption with no clear way out except to prove the evidence mattered more than the authority to present it. Marin left Pittsburgh on the 11:40 a.m. flight back to Chicago with the hard drive secured in a padded laptop case, and a decision crystallizing in her mind that felt less like strategy and more like accepting the only move left when every other option has been foreclosed by people who wrote the rules specifically to trap you. She couldn't win as an owner anymore because the trustee had her voting power and the board would proceed with or without her input, which meant the only leverage she had left was evidence. Raw data that couldn't be harmonized or reinterpreted or dismissed as partisan interference because it existed independent of who held it. The question wasn't whether to use the evidence. It was how to get it in front of people who had the authority to act on it before Corbin and Jory could classify it as compromised and bury it under the same procedural delays they'd used to keep the monitor blind for 3 months. Dr. Amarian had given her more than the hard drive. He'd given her the name of the independent monitor, Maria Laskin, a compliance specialist who worked out of Chicago and had been trying to access the sealed samples for 96 days, while being told that chain of custody protocols needed updating before transmission could resume. She's called me 14 times, Dr. Amarian had said, pulling up an email thread that showed increasing frustration in professional language. Requests for status updates met with assurances that systems were being reviewed and corrected. Every time I try to send her the files, Building Systems flags it as a security violation and routes it back through their approval process. Which meant Jory Kellen had positioned himself as a gatekeeper between the monitor and the truth, approving what got through and delaying what didn't, all while maintaining the appearance of cooperation, because cooperation without delivery is how bureaucracies kill accountability. Marin had asked Dr. Amarian one more question before leaving the lab. If the monitor requested the samples directly, in person, could you release them without routing through Building Systems? His answer had been immediate. She'd need to present credentials and a formal data preservation request, but yes, once that's documented, I have authority to comply without additional approval. The phrase data preservation request was the key because it shifted the burden from Marin trying to prove interference to the monitor trying to preserve evidence. And if Marin could get the monitor to act independently, the evidence would enter the record through proper channels even if the person who'd alerted her to its existence had no official standing left. The flight landed at O'Hare at 1:47 p.m., and Marin took a cab to a coffee shop in the Loop 2 blocks from Whitlock Meridian headquarters, the kind of place where professionals met clients and discussed contracts, and no one paid attention to anyone else's conversation because everyone was absorbed in their own. She set up her laptop at a corner table, pulled up the contact information Claudia had sent her for the trustee's representative, a man named Harris Tremaine who worked out of a Midtown Manhattan office and had filed the interference notice that morning, and composed an email she knew would be read by people looking for evidence she was still trying to control governance outcomes. The message was short, procedural, stripped of anything that could be classified as instruction or demand. I've become aware of field performance data held in sealed storage at the Allegheny County facility. An independent monitor has been attempting to access this data for review. I believe the monitor's access has been delayed through internal routing procedures. I'm providing this information for your awareness as the current trustee authority. She sent it, knowing it would accomplish two things. First, it would document that she was directing information toward proper oversight instead of trying to manage it herself. And second, it would force the trustee to either acknowledge the monitor's existence or explain why they weren't facilitating her access to data that was supposed to be independently verified. Then she opened a second email window and composed a message to Mireya Laskin using an address Dr. Amarian had provided from the monitor's official correspondence. This one was even shorter. Dr. Felix Amarian at Allegheny facility has sealed samples relevant to your review. Chain of custody intact. He's authorized to release upon formal preservation request. Suggest contact within 24 hours before samples are compromised by custody transfer. She signed it with initials that meant nothing and sent it from an email account created 30 minutes earlier, anonymous but actionable. By 3:15 p.m. Marin was back in her apartment in Evanston, watching her phone for responses that would tell her whether the pivot from owner to witness would work or whether she'd just documented her own continued interference for the trustee's legal team to add to their filing. The apartment still felt violated from the break-in 2 days earlier, the missing notebook and planted envelope like evidence someone could reach her anywhere. But she'd stopped expecting safety and started operating on the assumption that everything she did was being monitored by people with resources and legal authority and no particular interest in whether the water systems they were defending actually worked in the counties they were installed. Her phone buzzed at 4:02 p.m., unknown number, and Marin's chest tightened as she read the message. The monitor filed a preservation request 30 minutes ago. Building Systems is trying to delay approval pending security review. If you want this to matter, someone needs to be in that boardroom when the vote happens to ask why field data doesn't match compliance reports. The message came with an attachment, a screenshot of an internal routing form showing Jory Kellen's signature on a delay authorization, the reason listed as custody verification incomplete, and the estimated resolution timeline marked as 7 to 10 business days, which meant the board would vote. Corbin would become CEO, or someone equally committed to stability would take the seat. And by the time the samples were released, the narrative would already be set and the data would be coming. Inconvenient footnote instead of a crisis requiring immediate response. Marin stared at the screenshot and understood that anonymous messages and procedural notifications weren't going to be enough, that someone with standing had to be in the room when the board voted to force them to confront the evidence before they could dismiss it. But the only people with standing were board members and executives and the trustee's representative, none of whom had incentive to disrupt a vote that promised stability over accountability. She thought about Darnell, about whether he'd signed the separation agreement yet, or whether he was still trying to figure out how to protect his daughter while refusing to admit guilt for something he didn't do. And she realized that the person who needed to be in that boardroom wasn't her. It was someone who could ask the question the board didn't want to answer and do it in a way that couldn't be classified as interference because it was just an employee trying to defend himself against false accusations. She pulled up the email Dr. Amarian had forwarded, the one showing the monitor's 14 attempts to access data that kept getting routed through Building Systems approval, and saw in the timestamp metadata that the most recent attempt had been flagged at 8:47 a.m. that morning, exactly 3 minutes before Darnell's badge had been deactivated in the lab corridor. The timing wasn't coincidence, it was coordination, because removing Darnell's access removed his ability to submit formal data requests that would create a paper trail connecting his field failure reports to the sealed samples the monitor was trying to review. Someone had been tracking the monitor's requests and making sure the person who could corroborate them was silenced before the correlation became obvious. Marin's phone buzzed again, different number this time, and the message was from Dr. Amarian. Monitor requested samples by name. King County baseline comparison, Pierce County membrane degradation, Genesee County flow rate variance. She knows what she's looking for. Someone briefed her. The text came with a second line that made Marin's pulse spike. I'm flying to Chicago tonight to deliver the drive personally. If Building Systems tries to block digital transmission, They can't stop me from hand-carrying physical evidence to the monitor's office. The message ended with a question. Can you get me into the building tomorrow without Kellen knowing I'm there? Marin read the question 3 times while her mind sorted through possibilities. Dr. Amarian arriving at O'Hare meant the evidence would be in Chicago by morning, which meant the monitor could access it before the board vote if someone could get the hard drive to her office without routing it through building systems infrastructure. But getting into Whitlock Meridian headquarters without Jory Kellen knowing meant using access that wouldn't flag on the security logs he monitored, which meant vendor credentials or contractor routes or the kind of service entrance protocols Marin had been using for the past 4 nights while she thought she was being invisible. She typed a response. Land at O'Hare, take the blue line to the loop, meet me at the coffee shop on Wacker at 6 a.m. I'll get you to the monitor's floor. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up the building systems directory she'd photographed 3 nights ago, the one that listed every office and occupant in the headquarters tower, and found what she needed on the 41st floor. Maria Laskin. Independent monitor, Suite 4127. The office was 2 floors below the board suite, accessible through the same service elevators Marin had been using, and if Dr. Amarian could deliver the hard drive directly to the monitor before the vote, the board would have to explain why they were appointing a CEO while ignoring field failure data that an independent oversight authority had just flagged as critical. It wouldn't stop the vote. The trustee controlled that now, but it would force the vote to happen in front of evidence that made stability look like negligence instead of leadership. Marin spent the rest of the evening preparing 2 things: a facilities access route that would get Dr. Amarian from the service entrance to the 41st floor without passing security checkpoints Jory controlled, and a timeline showing exactly when the monitor had requested samples and when Darnell's access had been revoked, because patterns mattered more than individual incidents, and the pattern here was clear enough that even a board committed to choosing comfort over accountability would have trouble ignoring it. By 11:30 p.m., she had both documents ready, saved on a thumb drive she could hand to Dr. Amarian in the morning, and she sat in her apartment thinking about her father and wondering if he'd anticipated this exact scenario when he'd signed the voting trust. Whether he'd imagined his daughter losing control of the company while trying to protect it, and whether he would have written the clause differently if he'd known that the threat to stability wouldn't come from her interference, but from the people who'd learned how to use his protective architecture as a weapon. Her phone buzzed one final time before midnight, the unknown number that had been tracking her movements for 4 days, and the message was shorter than all the others. The monitor's name has been mentioned in board emails 3 times today. Security stopped logging it after the second mention. Ask yourself why. Marin read it, screenshot it, and added it to the collection of evidence she was building even though she had no official authority to present it, because the difference between a witness and a bystander isn't power. It's whether you decide that documentation matters even when the people with authority tell you it doesn't. Dr. Felix Amarian landed at O'Hare at 5:43 a.m. and met Marin at the coffee shop on Wacker Drive exactly as planned, carrying the hard drive in a messenger bag that looked like any other consultant's equipment and wearing the tired expression of someone who'd spent a red-eye flight reading emails that confirmed his worst suspicions about how oversight systems could be corrupted from the inside. The monitor filed her preservation request through official channels, he said, setting his bag on the table between them and keeping his voice low even though the early morning crowd was absorbed in their own caffeine and urgency. Building Systems acknowledged receipt and then flagged it for security review with an estimated completion timeline that conveniently extends past today's board vote. He pulled out his phone and showed Marin the email thread, Jory Kellen's signature appearing 3 times in 12 hours, once to acknowledge, once to request additional documentation, once to extend the review period pending what the message called custody verification protocols that ensure data integrity. Marin read the emails with the kind of cold focus that comes from watching a trap you predicted actually spring, and she understood that Jory wasn't just delaying the monitor's access. He was building a paper trail that would make the delay look like responsible caution, the kind of procedural carefulness that boards love because it transforms negligence into governance. He's running out the clock, she said, more to herself than to Dr. Amarian. By the time the review completes, Corbin will be CEO and the data becomes a problem for future leadership instead of a disqualification for current candidates. Dr. Amarian nodded, his jaw tight. which is why I'm here instead of sending files through channels he controls. If we can get this to the monitor directly, she can review it independently and present findings before the vote. They left the coffee shop at 6:12 a.m. and walked 3 blocks to the service entrance on Wacker that Marin had been using for 4 nights, the one that opened to a loading dock, where vendors delivered supplies and contractors accessed equipment storage without passing through the main lobby security that Jory's systems monitored in real time. Marin used the facility's override code she'd memorized from watching maintenance staff, and the door clicked open without alarms or notifications because service entrances are designed to be accessible to people who keep buildings running, and the system assumes those people don't have reasons to route around official protocols. They took the service elevator to the 41st floor, the same elevator that had stopped between levels 2 days ago, when someone wanted to send Marin a message that being invisible only worked until the building decided to look, and when the doors opened onto the executive corridor. Dr. Amarian followed Marin with the careful footwork of someone who understands he's entering territory where his presence could be classified as trespassing even though he has every professional reason to be. Delivering evidence to an official monitor. Suite 4127 was at the end of the corridor, past offices that belonged to compliance staff and risk management teams, and the nameplate on the door read Maria Laskin. Independent oversight in letters that suggested authority without requiring decoration. Marin knocked twice, heard movement inside, and when the door opened, she found herself facing a woman in her late 40s with steel gray hair and the kind of expression that makes you understand immediately that she's not interested in explanations that waste time. Dr. Amarian, the monitor said, eyes moving to the messenger bag with recognition that suggested she'd been expecting this delivery even if she hadn't known when it would arrive. And you are? She directed the question at Marin with the flat tone of someone who knows an unidentified person in a restricted corridor is either authorized or about to be escorted out by security. Marin made a choice in that half-second that felt less like deception and more like the only truth that mattered in the moment. I'm the person who flagged that your sample requests were being routed through building systems delays, she said, keeping her voice even and her shoulders relaxed, because looking defensive makes people suspicious even when you have nothing to hide. Dr. Amarian has the sealed samples from Allegheny County. Chain of custody intact. Hash logs match the baseline data you've been trying to access for 3 months. Mireya's eyes narrowed slightly. Not with suspicion, but with the sharp attention of someone hearing confirmation of something they already suspected, and she stepped back to let them into an office that looked exactly like what independent oversight should look like: filing cabinets with physical locks, a computer that wasn't connected to the building's network, and a wall covered in printed timelines and data flow charts that mapped how information was supposed to move through the company versus how it actually moved when people with access started controlling which requests got approved and which got delayed into irrelevance. Dr. Amarian set the hard drive on Mireya's desk and pulled out a printed manifest that listed every sample by county, date, and lot number, the kind of documentation that turns raw data into evidence by proving exactly what was collected and when. King County baseline comparison, Pierce County membrane degradation analysis, Genesee County flow rate variance. All of it sealed immediately after collection and stored under protocols that prevent tampering, he said, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who's spent his career making sure the science can defend itself against people who want to reinterpret results. The hash values are printed on the manifest. You can verify integrity before running any analysis. Mireya took the manifest, scanned the first page, and her expression shifted in a way that suggested she was seeing confirmation of a pattern she'd been tracking for longer than 3 months. I've been requesting access to these samples since November, she said, pulling up a file on her independent computer that showed a timeline Marin recognized, monitor requests in green, building systems responses in red, and a gap between them that widened every time Jory Kellen inserted another review requirement. Every request gets acknowledged, logged, and then delayed pending verification of custody protocols that were already verified when the samples were sealed. She turned the screen so they could see the pattern: 14 requests over 96 days. Each one met with professional courtesy and bureaucratic delay, and Marin felt something cold settle in her chest because the pattern wasn't incompetence or miscommunication. It was deliberate obstruction disguised as procedural carefulness, and someone had been coordinating the delays with enough sophistication to make them look like responsible governance instead of evidence suppression. Who has authority to approve custody transfers in your system? Marin asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it said out loud, so the trap's architecture became visible to everyone in the room. Maria's response was immediate. Building Systems Supervisor. All physical and digital transfers route through that authorization chain to ensure security compliance. She pulled up another document, this one showing the approval hierarchy, and at the top of the chain sat a name Marin had seen on badge cloning requests and access logs and delay authorizations. Jory Kellen, Building Systems and Compliance Liaison. He's the gatekeeper, Maria said, and the word gatekeeper carried the weight of someone who'd spent months trying to access information that was supposedly independent but had to pass through channels one person controlled. Dr. Amarian's phone buzzed, and when he checked the screen his expression tightened. Building Systems just sent me a notification, he said, turning the phone so they could see the automated message. Unauthorized access detected. Allegheny Facility Sample Storage. Security review initiated. The timestamp showed the notification had been triggered 4 minutes ago, which meant someone was monitoring the storage area in real time and had flagged the moment Dr. Amarian's access credentials were used to retrieve the hard drive he was now delivering to the monitor. They know I pulled the samples, he said, voice quiet but urgent. Which means they know where I am and what I'm carrying. Marin felt her pulse spike because unauthorized access was the language they'd used to classify Dr. Amarian's action as a violation instead of a delivery, and if Building Systems could paint the evidence as improperly obtained, they could question its validity before anyone reviewed what it actually showed. How long until they can lock down this floor? She asked Maria, who was already moving toward her desk phone with the practiced speed of someone who'd navigated corporate obstruction before. Depends on whether they want to make it obvious. The monitor replied, dialing a number from memory. If they lock the floor, they have to explain why. If they just delay my review, they can claim procedural grounds. Marin's phone buzzed in her pocket, the unknown number that had been tracking her movements for 5 days, and when she pulled it up the message was exactly what she'd been dreading. If you say your name in that building, you lose the company. If you don't, the counties lose the water. She read it twice, her hands cold, because the message made explicit what had been implicit all along. The trustee had her voting power, but revealing her identity in the building while presenting evidence would give them grounds to claim she was still interfering, still trying to control governance outcomes. And the counties circled in red on that abandoned printout would keep drinking water from systems that were failing field tests no one in authority was willing to acknowledge. Mireya finished her call and turned back to them with an expression that suggested bad news delivered efficiently. The board vote is scheduled for 9 a.m. in the executive suite. I've requested access to present preliminary findings before the vote proceeds, but Building Systems is requiring executive approval for monitor presence in board sessions. She said it calmly, but Marin heard the trap in the language. Executive approval meant Corbinvale's approval, which meant the person being evaluated got to decide whether the evaluator could present evidence that would disqualify him. Can you present findings without being in the room? Marin asked. Mireya shook her head. Not with authority. I can file a written report, but written reports get read after votes happen, not before. Dr. Amarian looked at the hard drive on Mireya's desk, then at Marin, then at the monitor, and asked the question that would determine whether evidence mattered more than process. If you verify the hash values and confirm the data shows systematic failure, can you halt the vote on safety grounds? Mireya's answer was careful, legally precise. I can recommend a halt. I can flag critical safety concerns. But I can't force the board to act on my recommendations unless there's a regulatory trigger that requires immediate response. She pulled up another document, this one showing the company's compliance framework, and pointed to a section that made Marin's stomach drop. Emergency safety halt requires either regulatory agency intervention or board majority vote. I don't have unilateral authority to stop governance proceedings, which meant the evidence could be perfect. The monitor could verify every field failure, and the board could still vote to appoint Corbin as CEO while promising to address the monitor's concerns through future review, because boards are very good at separating immediate decisions from long-term consequences. when the immediate decision protects their preferred outcome. Marin thought about Darnell, about whether he'd signed the separation agreement yet, or whether he was sitting in a lawyer's office trying to figure out how to defend himself against accusations backed by login records that had been forged using cloned credentials. And she thought about the counties where people were drinking water that was passing lab tests but failing in the field because someone had decided that harmonizing data was more important than fixing systems. The board needs to hear this before they vote, Marin said. And both Maria and Dr. Amarian looked at her with expressions that suggested they understood what she was proposing and why it was dangerous. Not from me, she added quickly, because revealing herself would trigger exactly what the anonymous text had warned against. From someone who has standing to question the data. Someone whose innocence depends on proving the field failures were real and the harmonized compliance reports were the actual fraud. Dr. Amarian understood first. Darnell, he said. If he's in that boardroom when you present the hard drive data, he can ask the questions that force the board to choose between appointing Corbin or acknowledging they were about to sacrifice an honest employee to protect a corrupt executive. Maria was already opening her email, fingers moving across the keyboard with the efficiency of someone who'd spent a career writing messages that had to be legally defensible and morally clear at the same time. I can request his presence as a material witness to data integrity questions, she said. Building systems can't block that without admitting they're trying to prevent witness testimony. Marin's phone buzzed again, same unknown number, and this time the message was a single sentence that felt like confirmation and threat combined. Jory Kellen has been watching the 41st floor security feed for 6 minutes. He knows you're all in that office. She looked at the message, looked at the door, and understood that the next hour would determine whether documentation mattered more than authority, whether one person with a hard drive and a monitor with independent standing could force a board to confront truth they'd spent 3 months trying to avoid, and whether the systems designed to protect oversight could be reclaimed from the people who'd learned to weaponize them. The board suite doors opened at 8:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the scheduled vote, and Marin watched from her position near the service corridor junction where cleaning staff parked equipment carts during executive sessions, close enough to see the glass-walled conference room, but far enough to maintain the invisibility that was the only authority she had left. Directors filed in with the practiced calm of people who'd already decided how they would vote, and were just waiting for the formality of procedure to make it official, and Corbin Vale entered last, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who'd spent a week positioning every variable to ensure this moment would arrive exactly as he'd planned. The boardroom's glass walls made everything visible but not audible, and Marin could see lips moving and heads nodding and documents being distributed across the table. The physical choreography of governance that looked deliberate and responsible right up until you understood that the most important evidence wasn't in the room because the people who controlled access had made sure it wouldn't arrive in time to disrupt the preferred outcome. Then Maria Laskin appeared in the corridor, walking with Dr. Amarian and a third person Marin recognized even from 30 feet away, Darnell Sloan, dressed in the same clothes he'd worn 2 days ago when security had escorted him out of the lab, looking like a man who'd spent 48 hours deciding whether fighting back was worth the cost, and had concluded that some things mattered more than safety. Mireya knocked on the boardroom door with the kind of authoritative patience that suggested she'd done this before and knew exactly how long to wait before knocking again. And when a board assistant opened the door, Marin could see Corbin's expression shift from confident to wary in the half-second before he controlled it back to neutral. I'm here under independent monitor authority to present preliminary findings relevant to today's governance proceedings, Mireya said, voice carrying down the corridor with the clear diction of someone who knew her words would be remembered and possibly quoted in future legal proceedings. I've requested Mr. Sloan's presence as a material witness to data integrity questions that directly impact the CEO selection criteria. The assistant looked uncertain, glanced back toward the board chair, and Marin saw Nedra Swayze, a woman whose career had been built on appearing reasonable while making ruthless decisions, gesture for them to enter, not because she wanted the disruption, but because refusing an independent monitor's request in front of witnesses would create exactly the kind of optics boards spend millions to avoid. Corbin stood as they entered, and Marin watched him recalibrate his strategy in real time, switching from confidence to concern in a performance so smooth It would have been convincing if she hadn't spent 4 nights watching him rehearse different versions of himself, depending on which audience he was managing. I wasn't aware the monitor had findings ready for presentation, he said, directing the comment toward Nedra in a tone that suggested Maria's arrival was a procedural irregularity rather than independent oversight, doing exactly what independent oversight was supposed to do. The board appreciates transparency, but we have a scheduled vote and a covenant timeline that requires resolution today. He said resolution with the weight of someone reminding everyone that delay had consequences, and Marin understood he was trying to frame the choice as stability versus disruption before anyone looked at what the disruption was actually disrupting. Nedra's response was measured, the voice of someone who'd learned long ago that appearing open to information was different from actually being open to changing your mind. We have time for preliminary findings, she said, which was both permission and boundary. You can speak, but keep it brief, and don't expect this to derail what we've already decided. Mireya set the hard drive on the conference table with the deliberate care of someone presenting evidence that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or speculation, and pulled out the printed manifest Dr. Amarian had prepared showing county-by-county sample data with hash values that proved the integrity of what was about to be reviewed. Over the past 96 days, I've requested access to sealed field samples from 6 municipal installations, she began, her tone documentary rather than accusatory. Every request was acknowledged by building systems and then delayed pending custody verification protocols. Yesterday, I received these samples directly from the Allegheny County Facility Supervisor. She opened her laptop, the one that wasn't connected to the building's network, the one Jory Kellen couldn't monitor remotely, and pulled up a comparison table that showed lab compliance data on the left and field performance data on the right. And even from the corridor, Marin could see that the numbers didn't match. That systems passing internal tests were failing in King County and Pierce County and Genesee County and every other location where the water actually had to work instead of just look good on compliance reports. The variance between baseline expectations and field performance ranges from 29% to 41% across all sites, Mireya continued. These samples were flagged for review in November. Building Systems Supervisor Jory Kellen acknowledged my preservation requests and then initiated security reviews that effectively prevented analysis until this morning. Corbin's counterpunch came exactly where Marin knew it would, not at the data, but at the process. If there's a custody question, we need to resolve that before relying on potentially compromised samples, he said, directing his attention toward the board members who looked most uncomfortable with technical details. The monitor's role is important, but we can't delay critical governance decisions based on preliminary findings that haven't been validated through proper channels. The phrase proper channels was the key because it made Mireya's direct collection of evidence sound irregular instead of necessary, and Marin watched 2 directors nod in a way that suggested they were grateful someone had given them permission to ignore information that made their preferred choice more complicated. Then Darnell did something Marin hadn't expected, something that shifted the room's moral weight in a way no amount of data could. He didn't defend himself, didn't argue about his innocence or demand apologies for the accusations that had cost him his badge and nearly cost him his career. He just looked at the directors with the steady gaze of someone who'd stopped caring about his own outcome and started caring only about making sure the truth got said out loud. My daughter drinks the same water as yours, he said, voice quiet enough that everyone had to lean forward slightly to hear, which made the words land harder than if he'd shouted them. If you need someone to blame so you can keep the Austin contract and make the lenders happy, pick me. I understand how this works. He paused, let the sentence settle, then added the part that made it impossible to look away, but don't call it stability. Call it what it is. The emotional oxygen moment arrived not as relief, but as recognition. A brief second where the room had to sit with the reality that they were about to sacrifice a man who tried to keep water honest, so they could appoint a leader who'd learned how to make dishonesty look like procedure. Marin felt her throat tighten watching it happen, watching Darnell choose dignity over safety, and she understood that this was the moment the board would either remember their responsibility or choose comfort, and nothing she could do from the corridor would influence that choice because she'd already lost the authority to speak. Nedra Swayze's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that Marin could see the hairline fracture in her composure. The moment when appearing reasonable required actually being reasonable because the alternative was too visible, too documented by the monitor's presence, too witnessed by people who would remember. "We're not proceeding with this vote until council reviews the monitor's findings," she said, and her voice carried the kind of steel that suggested the decision was final even if it wasn't the decision Corbin had spent a week engineering. She looked at Maria. "How long do you need to complete your analysis?" But before Maria could answer, Corbin made his final play, the one Marin had been waiting for, because she'd seen the voting trust clause and understood exactly how someone who'd built his career on leveraging institutional architecture would use it. "If this is Marin Whitlock operating through proxies," he said, careful to make it sound hypothetical while making sure everyone understood it wasn't. "And if she's been conducting covert observation of board proceedings, the irrevocable voting trust clause requires immediate transfer of her voting power to the designated trustee. We have documentation of facilities access under false credentials, surveillance of executive functions, and direct interference in governance proceedings during a declared covenant emergency." He pulled out a folder that looked exactly like the separation agreement they'd tried to make Darnell sign, except this one had legal clauses and trustee notifications and all the procedural weight of authority that had been waiting for the right moment to become a weapon. "The trustee filed notice yesterday," Corbin continued, directing his words toward Nedra, but making sure every director could hear. "The board is obligated to recognize the transfer and proceed under trustee authority, which means this vote isn't delayed, it's required. We stabilize leadership, we address the monitor's concerns through proper review channels, and we meet our covenant obligations without letting speculation disrupt the process." Marin felt the corridor walls press closer, felt her phone heavy in her pocket with the anonymous warning still glowing in her message history, and understood that Corbin had just made the choice explicit for the board. Halt the vote and acknowledge they'd been wrong about Darnell and the data, or proceed with the vote and let the trustee's authority override any objections the owner might raise. Either way, Corbin positioned himself as the stable choice, the leader who could navigate crisis without getting distracted by uncomfortable evidence. And the board could tell themselves they were following proper governance even as they ignored field failures in 6 counties where people trusted that filtered water meant safe water. Maria's response was immediate and devastating in its precision. "The trust clause triggers on interference with the vote," she said, pulling up the exact language on her laptop and turning the screen so the board could see it. "Not on preservation of evidence related to public safety. If you obstruct data review during an active safety anomaly, you expose the company, and yourselves personally, to liability that makes governance disputes look minor." She let that sink in, let the phrase personally liable do its work, then added the sentence that changed the room's calculation. "I'm filing a formal safety flag with the regulatory monitor for every county where field performance variance exceeds 25%. That filing happens today whether this vote proceeds or not." The room went still in a way that made Marin understand the board was doing math, not moral math, but risk math, calculating whether appointing Corbin was worth the personal exposure that came with ignoring a monitor's safety flag in a regulated industry where liability followed individuals and not just institutions. Nedra looked at the data comparison still displayed on Maria's laptop, looked at Darnell standing quietly near the door like a man who'd already accepted whatever came next, looked at Corbin with an expression that suggested she was recalculating exactly how much stability was worth when it came with regulatory flags and personal liability. "Call outside counsel," Nedra said to the board assistant, "and call the compliance team. No one leaves this room until we understand what we're actually voting on." Corbin's jaw tightened, and Marin saw the exact moment his confidence cracked. Not fear, but frustration, the look of someone who'd built a perfect machine and watched one variable refuse to behave the way the blueprint promised. Outside counsel arrived within 23 minutes, a woman from a firm that specialized in corporate crisis management and regulatory compliance, the kind of lawyer who gets paid to tell boards the truth they don't want to hear in language they can't ignore. She didn't waste time on pleasantries, just set her briefcase on the conference table and asked Maria a question that reframed the entire morning. "Are you prepared to testify that the field performance data you're presenting is materially different from the compliance reports this board has been reviewing?" Maria's answer was immediate and documented. Yes, and I can provide hash-verified chain of custody, proving these samples were sealed at collection and haven't been altered since November. The lawyer turned to Nedra. Then you can't vote to appoint leadership while actively ignoring a safety flag from your independent monitor. The liability exposure isn't theoretical. It's personal, and it's immediate. Corbin tried one more deflection, his voice still controlled, but carrying an edge that suggested he understood the room was moving away from him. The data discrepancy could indicate testing methodology variance, not actual system failure, he said, directing the comment toward the directors who looked most uncomfortable with technical details. We need time to review before making conclusions that could damage the company's reputation and contractual relationships. It was a reasonable-sounding argument until the outside counsel cut through it with the precision of someone who'd seen this play before. If methodology variance explains a 41% performance gap, your testing protocols are so flawed they constitute negligence, she said flatly. Either the systems are failing or your quality assurance is fraudulent. Neither option supports a CEO appointment today. Then Maria pulled up the access logs Dr. Amarian had provided, the ones showing Darnell's credentials being used to access filtration databases at times when Darnell himself was provably somewhere else. And the forensic logic that followed was the kind that breaks frames built on assumption rather than evidence. Mr. Sloan's login was flagged for data alteration at 2:03 a.m. on March 19th, she said, highlighting the timestamp on her screen. Building security footage shows Mr. Sloan in the executive corridor at that exact time, in front of 3 directors and 2 security personnel, being accused of the same data alteration his credentials were supposedly executing. She let the contradiction sit for 5 seconds, long enough for everyone in the room to do the math, then asked the question that made the math matter. Who has authority to issue credential duplicates in your system? The board assistant who'd been taking notes looked up from her laptop, scrolled through an administrative directory, and answered in a voice that suggested she hadn't understood the significance until she said it out loud. Building Systems Supervisor. All badge cloning and access replication routes through that department for security verification. Maria turned to Nedra. I'd like Building Systems Supervisor Jory Kellen brought to this meeting to explain the custody delays and the credential authorization timeline. Nedra made the call herself, speaking in the measured tone of someone who'd realized she was running a meeting that would either restore credibility or destroy it, depending on what the next hour revealed. 10 minutes later, Jory Kellen appeared in the boardroom doorway, facilities polo and equipment belt suggesting he'd been pulled from active work, and his expression when he saw Maria and Dr. Amarian and the hard drive on the conference table was the closest thing to panic Marin had seen on anyone's face all morning. You requested me? He said to Nedra, voice carefully neutral, but his eyes kept moving to the laptop screen showing access logs and timestamp comparisons. Mr. Kellen, can you explain why credential duplication requests for lab personnel would route through your department? Maria asked, not accusatory but procedural, the tone of someone building a record that would stand up under review. Jory's answer was textbook deflection. We handle all access security to maintain building integrity. If there was a duplication request, it would have been properly authorized and logged. Maria nodded as if accepting that answer, then pulled up a second screen showing the authorization log for Darnell's credential clone. The request filed 3 days before the first data alteration was flagged, the approval signature belonging to Jory himself, and the justification listed as Executive Directive pending compliance review. Who issued the Executive Directive? The outside counsel asked, and the question hung in the air like something sharp, because Executive Directive should have come with documentation, authorization, a paper trail that showed legitimate need instead of convenient excuse. Jory's composure finally cracked, not into confession, but into the silence of someone who'd just realized the procedural cover he'd built wouldn't hold under actual scrutiny. I need to review my records, he said, which was the answer people give when the real answer would end their career. Corbin stood abruptly, and the movement was sharp enough that everyone's attention shifted to him. This is becoming a distraction from the governance matter at hand, he said, trying to pull the room back toward the vote and away from the forensic unraveling of the frame he'd helped construct. We have covenant obligations, but Nedra cut him off with a gesture that suggested her patience for deflection had expired. We have a monitor presenting evidence that an employee was framed using cloned credentials, that field safety data was suppressed through custody delays, and that our interim CEO may have benefited from both," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from finally understanding you've been managed. "The vote is postponed. Mr. Sloan, you're reinstated pending full review. You will not be used as a scapegoat for systemic failures." The words reinstated and scapegoat landed in the room with the weight of an institutional reversal, and Marin watched Darnell's shoulders drop slightly, as if he'd been holding tension for 48 hours and could finally let it go. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate, just nodded once in acknowledgement of something that should never have required a fight, but had required exactly this fight, because corporations will always choose narrative over accountability unless someone forces the choice to be explicit. The outside counsel made 3 recommendations that became requirements before anyone left the boardroom. Immediate suspension of Corbin Vale pending investigation into his role in the Data Harmonization Directive, full audit of building systems access controls and credential authorization protocols, and county-by-county disclosure planning for every location where field performance variance exceeded 20%. The disclosure needs to be proactive, specific, and verified by the independent monitor, she said, looking at each director until they nodded. Tacoma, Seattle, Flint, Cleveland, Corpus Christi, Austin. Every municipality gets direct notification with testing data and remediation timelines. This isn't optional, and it isn't subject to PR approval. Corbin was escorted from the boardroom 40 minutes later, not in handcuffs or with security theatrics, but in the quiet, humiliating walk to a conference room where lawyers would ask questions he wouldn't want to answer and parse language that had sounded like leadership when he'd said it, but would sound like obstruction when read back in depositions. Marin watched from the service corridor as he passed, watched his face stay composed even as everything he'd positioned for collapsed under the weight of evidence he'd assumed would stay buried in building systems custody delays and procedural reviews. The board's public statement was restrained, procedural, the kind of language institutions use when they want to acknowledge error without admitting liability. CEO succession vote postponed pending completion of safety review. Independent monitor engaged for comprehensive field performance audit. Employee reinstatement following resolution of access security concerns. The words were careful and empty and exactly what boards say when they've been caught managing truth instead of serving it. But underneath the careful language was something that mattered more than rhetoric. Darnell's career was restored, the counties would get disclosure, and the monitor's oversight would proceed, without Jory Kellen's infrastructure blocking access to evidence. Marin stayed in the corridor until the boardroom emptied, until the directors filed out looking tired and chastened, and probably already planning how to spin this as responsible governance catching problems early, and she felt the complex weight of a partial win settle against her chest. She hadn't stopped the trustee from taking her voting power, hadn't prevented Corbin from getting close enough to the CEO seat to smell it, hadn't saved herself from the trap her father had built into the company's legal architecture. But she'd protected Darnell, she'd forced the evidence into daylight, she'd made the board choose between stability and accountability, and watched them choose accountability only after every comfortable option had been stripped away. She pulled out her phone and found a text from Dr. Amarian, time-stamped 6 minutes ago. Monitor confirmed hash integrity. Data goes to regulatory review tomorrow. Thank you for knowing when documentation matters more than authority. She read it twice, felt something like relief move through her exhaustion, and understood that witness was its own form of power even when institutional control had been transferred to people who measured success in quarterly stability instead of long-term truth. Marin left the building through the service entrance on Wacker Drive at 11:52 a.m., still dressed in the gray cleaner's polo that had become both disguise and truth over the past 5 days, and the spring air felt different against her skin than it had when she'd first put on the uniform and decided that watching was more important than controlling. The Chicago River moved beneath the bridge with the indifferent persistence of water that doesn't care about corporate governance or voting trusts or whether the person crossing it still owns the company her father built. And Marin stopped halfway across to look back at the headquarters tower where her voting power now belonged to a Manhattan trustee, and her authority had been reduced to documentation and witness testimony and the particular leverage that comes from refusing to let comfortable. Lies survived contact with evidence. Her phone had been quiet for 47 minutes. No unknown numbers sending cryptic warnings or threat confirmations. And the silence felt heavier than the messages because silence meant someone was watching and calculating and deciding what came next now that the ceremony they'd choreographed had been interrupted by a monitor who actually monitored and a lab director who'd flown evidence to Chicago instead of letting it die in custody review. Darnell had left the building 20 minutes before her, escorted not by security, but by HR personnel who were already drafting the restoration paperwork and the apology that institutions give when they've been caught sacrificing someone and need to pretend the sacrifice was never authorized. She'd watched him through the service corridor window, watched him call someone on his phone, probably his daughter's school, probably confirming pickup arrangements hadn't been changed by strangers who'd used her safety as leverage, and she'd felt the specific satisfaction that comes from protecting one person even when you can't protect the system that tried to destroy him. The county-by-county disclosure plan was already moving through legal review, municipalities being contacted with language that balanced transparency against liability, field performance data being packaged with remediation timelines and monitor verification protocols. Tacoma and Seattle and Washington, Flint and Michigan, Cleveland and its suburbs in Ohio, Corpus Christi in Texas, Austin with its high-profile contract. All of them would receive notice that the filtration systems they'd trusted were passing lab tests, but failing field performance at variance rates that required immediate review and potential equipment replacement. It wasn't the outcome the board had wanted, wasn't the stability Corbin had promised, wasn't the quarterly calm the lenders had demanded, but it was the truth being forced into daylight by people who'd decided documentation mattered more than institutional comfort. Marin reached her apartment in Evanston by 1:30 p.m., exhausted in a way that felt cellular rather than physical, and found the space exactly as she'd left it that morning. No new violations, no planted envelopes, no evidence someone had been inside reminding her that surveillance was permanent and privacy was conditional. She made coffee she didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table where the voting trust clause photocopy had been left 3 days ago, the highlighted sentence still visible in her memory even though she'd burned the actual page. Choose silence or lose control. The choice had been false because the control was already lost, had been lost the moment she put on the cleaner's uniform and stepped into her own building under a borrowed identity. And the silence she'd chosen wasn't surrender. It was the recognition that some battles can't be won through authority and have to be won through witness. Her attorney Claudia called at 2:47 p.m. with an update that confirmed what Marin already knew. The trustee had accepted the board's decision to postpone the CEO vote and had indicated they would maintain voting authority through the safety review period, which wasn't defined by timeline, but by their determination of when the company was sufficiently stabilized to return governance to normal ownership structures. They're not saying you can't get your voting power back, Claudia explained, voice carrying the careful precision of someone parsing legal language that was designed to sound reassuring while committing to nothing. They're saying the emergency conditions that triggered the transfer need to be resolved before restoration can be considered, and they get to define what resolved means. Marin ended the call and sat with the reality that she'd saved Darnell and forced disclosure and stopped Corbin from becoming CEO. But the larger architecture of control, the trust clause, the trustee authority, the legal framework her father had built to protect the company from her interference, remained intact and functional and ready to be used again the moment she tried to reclaim the authority she'd surrendered by caring enough to investigate. She thought about her father, about whether he'd anticipated this exact scenario, or whether he'd just understood that ownership without accountability was dangerous, and had built the trap without realizing it could be weaponized by the people who benefited from keeping accountability theoretical rather than practical. Her phone buzzed at 4:18 p.m., the unknown number that had been tracking her movements and decisions for 5 days, and when she opened the message, the words on the screen felt less like threat and more like confirmation that the story she thought she'd finished was actually just entering its second act. You think you stopped the sale. You only stopped the ceremony. Marin read it 3 times, her chest tightening with each pass, because the message made explicit what she'd been trying not to acknowledge, that the CEO vote had never been the actual mechanism of transfer, that the voting trust and the trustee authority and the emergency stabilization language had always been the real architecture of ownership change. And she'd interrupted a performance while the actual transaction continued behind procedural language she couldn't challenge without triggering the exact clauses that had already stripped her voting power. She pulled up the trust document on her laptop, the one she'd photographed in the legal suite before any of this had started, and read the stabilization clause with new attention to what it didn't say. Voting authority shall remain with the designated trustee until such time as the company's operational, financial, and governance structures are deemed stable by trustee determination, at which point restoration shall proceed according to terms established during the stabilization period. The phrase terms established during the stabilization period sat on the screen like a trap she'd walked past while focused on the more obvious danger, because it meant the trustee could use the emergency period to restructure governance, rewrite bylaws, establish new approval mechanisms, and return voting power only after ensuring that power couldn't be used to disrupt whatever stability they'd engineered. Marin stood and walked to her window, looking out over Evanston streets where people were living ordinary afternoons that didn't include voting trusts or corporate sabotage or the particular exhaustion that comes from winning a battle while watching the war get redefined around you. Darnell's daughter would come home from school to a father who still had a job. The county circled in red would get disclosure and remediation instead of harmonized silence, and the monitor's oversight would proceed without Jory Kellen blocking access to evidence. Those victories were real and they mattered, and they would change outcomes for actual people in actual places, but they didn't answer the question the anonymous message had raised. If the ceremony was just theater and the sale was happening through different mechanisms, what exactly had she stopped, and what was still moving forward while she stood in her apartment trying to decide what witness looked like when the systems you were witnessing had already learned how to route around your resistance? Her phone buzzed again, same number, and this time the message included an attachment, a PDF of a trustee filing dated that morning, submitted to corporate registry at 6:47 a.m. before the board vote had even started, proposing governance amendments that would require supermajority approval for any ownership challenge to trustee determinations during stabilization periods. The filing was procedural, technical, the kind of document that gets processed by clerks who don't read for meaning and approved by regulators who assume institutions are acting in good faith, and it would become effective in 30 days unless challenged by parties with standing to object. Marin had standing, but challenging it would require revealing she was monitoring trustee actions, which could be classified as continued interference, which could extend the stabilization period indefinitely while the trustee restructured governance to make her theoretical ownership into practical irrelevance. She sat back down at the kitchen table and made a decision that felt less like surrender and more like choosing which fight mattered most. She could spend the next 6 months battling the trustee through legal channels that were designed to favor institutional continuity over individual authority, or she could do what she'd done for the past 5 days and document everything, preserve every filing, track every amendment, and build a record that would survive whether she won back voting power or not. The trustee thought they were securing stability, thought they were protecting the company from an owner who demonstrated she would interfere during crisis. But what they were actually doing was creating a documented history of exactly how ownership gets transferred when legal architecture is weaponized by people who understand procedure better than the person who nominally controls the institution. Subscribe before you tell yourself that partial wins are the same as safety, because the systems that pretend to stabilize are often just buying time to restructure around the resistance they couldn't eliminate. And the only defense against patient institutional power is documentation that refuses to let the quiet moves stay hidden. Marin opened a new file on her laptop, titled it Trustee Actions, Stabilization Period Documentation, and began building the timeline that would show how voting trusts sold as protection could become mechanisms of permanent transfer when the people who administered them understood that emergency powers were only temporary if someone had the leverage to demand their expiration. She didn't know if she'd win back control, didn't know if the trustee would eventually return her voting authority or restructure governance so thoroughly that authority became symbolic, but she knew that documentation was its own form of power and witness was its own form of resistance. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is make sure the machine can't pretend it was always designed this way when someone finally asks how ownership changed hands without anyone noticing the theft. Outside her window, the afternoon light shifted toward evening, ordinary and indifferent, and Marin Whitlock sat in an apartment that had been violated by people who could reach her anywhere and started building the record that would prove the ceremony and the sale were never the same thing. And the only way to stop the sale was to make sure everyone could see it happening.